Arab traders, Malay traders, Indonesian traders arrived in that port in order to distribute it to wherever they came from. We know a little bit about this Kalapa because of a particular kind of strange monk, actually, called Bujanga Manik, who walked around in Java in the year somewhere around 1480s, late, say, 15th century, before the Portuguese or Europeans arrived in the region. Bujanga Manik was a prince from an empire that was just south of what is now Jakarta, Bogor. He decided that the princely life was not something for him, and he wanted to become a monk, kind of an austere monk, and he decided to travel all over Java. He made 2 of those journeys. One of them brought him even to Bali, which he found even in those days a terribly crowded place. He didn't like it at all. But one of these journeys, he is in Java and takes a boat back to get back home. And that boat eventually goes to Kalapa. And he writes that he arrives in Jakarta, in Kalapa, has to register himself with the kind of administrators who presumably in those days just wrote down whoever and which boat had arrived and what traders were in town. So he administers himself over there, or he registers himself over there, but he didn't like crowded places that much, and therefore he continued his journey. But he mentions a couple of towns. Now, none of these towns we know, with the exception of one, and that is called Ancol. Ancol, he mentioned that is now another district in northern Jakarta, so that probably existed in those days as well. So that's the first kind of evidence that Kalapa was a decent-sized city and played some importance in those days. And you can see on this particular picture the roles that he wrote. His whole journey was written down on what we call lontar leaves, kind of dried leaves, and they were all put together. And in Old Sundanese, he wrote that down. Somebody in the 1600s, an Englishman, got these rolls somehow, brought them to Oxford University, where they went into a museum, and they were rediscovered by a Dutch professor, an expert in Sundanese languages in the mid-1960s, and he translated that story, and this is how we know all of this. Now, after that, the Portuguese arrive. That's in 1511. We know that they did trade there. They actually hammered a big stone in the ground at one particular point in time. And about 80, 90 years later, the Dutch arrived as well. And they were eventually under the leadership of this particular man, Jan Pieter van Koen. He's got quite a questionable history, this man. He's been involved with monopolizing the Spice Islands in the very far east of Indonesia by basically slaughtering all the population and re-importing people to these islands so that they would work for him. So he's been involved with what we can call a genocide, but he was also very much involved with the start of what is later called Batavia. The Dutch were, the Portuguese were the first to arrive, and they centered really on Malacca, the city in Malaysia, as their kind of entrepot for the whole region. The Dutch wanted to avoid that, so they didn't go, when they came from, say, around the corner of Africa, they didn't sail further north along India towards the northern tip of Sumatra and then further south, because they would have met the Portuguese. They tried the other way around and went to the southern part of Sumatra, in between Sumatra and Java, and landed there in a city called Banten. That's where they started to do their business. The Portuguese were there as well. Eventually didn't like it too much, some issues. They needed also warehouses, and they started to set up warehouses around a town called Jakarta. Jakarta was kind of an extension of Kalapa in those days. It was conquered by another kingdom in Jakarta by, say, 1527. So it was under control of another city further inland, not so relevant to us, but it was named Jakarta. So Kalapa became Jakarta. And the Dutch set up warehouses there and wanted to work with these Javanese and all the other people that lived there, Arabs, Chinese, whoever was trading there. But eventually the English showed up there as well, and it became a bit of a political power field. The English wanted to control, the Dutch wanted control over the city, the Indonesians wanted to control over the city. There were different groups of Indonesians, Javanese from further away, from another city nearby. So all of that became a bit of a geopolitical hornet's nest, and eventually the English and some Javanese tied themselves together, worked themselves together, and said, we're going to kick the Dutch out, we don't want them. That pretty much worked out. The Dutch were, they didn't have too many ships, only 5. The English had about 25 in the bay, so they were about to defeat the Dutch. And Jan Pieter van Koen, the leader of the Dutch contingent at the time, had to flee away, get reinforcements, took him 6 months, and he probably realized that by the time he would come back, the Dutch would all have been annihilated by the English and the Javanese. That didn't work out because the Javanese and English started to have disagreements on how to deal with a post-Dutch area, you could say, and it took so long that the Dutch were able to get reinforcements in, and when Jan Pieter van Koen stepped ashore, the English and the Javanese were still arguing. He was in no mood to go for any discussion. He basically kicked the English out, burned down their ships, burned down the whole city as well, kicked out the leaders of the city there and said, this is our place now, and we're going to call it Batavia. And we know a little bit how it looked like. This is the first map of, one of the first maps of Batavia. At the bottom you see the sea. We're looking from north towards south. I'm saying that because later on I have one or two maps whereby we look in the opposite direction. You can see the river coming in. It goes inland and then makes a large curl towards the left. And then there's a fort in the front on the left side, a city that is being built on the left side of the river as well. And you can see a city hall there with a couple of people in front of it. And on the right side of the river, so that is the western side of the river, there's a couple of fields with a couple of cows. And you can also see at the very close to the sea, there is this particular place where people had to register, similar to what Bujanga Manik, that wandering monk, did in around, say, 1480 or so. Now, there is actually a museum has asked an artist wants to make a kind of computer image of this, which looks quite nice, so I put it in here. So this is actually based on a few old maps, but this is how it looked like in those particular days. The Dutch ships in the front here, and then the river that goes in with the castle in the front and the city in the very back. And you can see the mountains in the far back as well. And if it rains, of course, the water comes down these mountains and would flood and go towards the city. It's a topic that we'll get to a little bit later on. Now, that city started to grow, and it was actually not just Dutch, but Chinese and Arabs, all kinds of people came there. There's a beautiful painting of one of the prime real estate kind of, you could say, prime real estate areas in that city called the Tijgersgracht, the Tiger Canal, where there's a beautiful boat here, but difficult to see here, but if you would go and scroll a little, look at the details of this particular painting, you could see all kinds of different people. They're Dutch, they're Chinese, they're Javanese walking there, as Arabs as well. It was actually a fairly cosmopolitan kind of town. So we're talking about 1619 was when the Dutch took it over, and this is around, say, 1620, 30, 40s when that city was built up. And in the book, we tell the story of a lady that arrived there. Again, you wonder why she actually goes to this town in 1621 when she arrives in Batavia. We know very little about this lady, but it's lucky that later on in her life, there's a court case. She comes to court, and at court they ask her what she's basically been doing in the city. And she tells that to the court, and the scribbles, they write it all down. And in the archives, we can find that story, and that brings that city to life. The interesting thing is that she arrived just at a very uncertain time. Batavia was just established, but it wasn't that the Javanese said, okay, Dutch, you're there and you can build that city. They wanted to kick these Dutch out. And in 1628 and 1629, they did. They had two large attacks. It failed for a variety of reasons to kick the Dutch really out. Really to do with logistics. They didn't have enough water and food to a large extent for their armies, but the armies arrived there in order to kick the Dutch out. That lady, Treintje, which, as I mentioned earlier on, had arrived in 1621, had set up a plantation business that was completely burned down. She lost all her money. She lost her husband in the war as well. Had to go into another business that was actually the distillery of gin at the time, made money out of it, and was able later on to build a beautiful stone house at close to this particular canal. So this is the city that she lived in, and in the book we go in much detail of how her life looked like and how the city looked like in those days. But this picture is a nice illustration of that. Now, by the late 1650s or so, this is how the map roughly looked like. So now we're looking from south to north. The castle is, as you can see there, on the eastern side of the river, very prominent there. Then the city is below it, but you can see that instead of just a couple of goats and cows, the right side of the city has been built as well. There is a Portuguese church, and in the middle you can see there's something written called Viewpoint of Beekman's painting. In a second I'm going to go to that particular painting and show it to you, but the city had grown and was really encompassed by a large wall and a canal, So fairly safe. A castle there for any particular trouble that might come from the sea. So it was a decent, nice city. A lot of Portuguese actually arrived in the city as well, Portuguese traders or slaves, so people that had links to the Portuguese in Malacca and did trade there. So there was a Malacca street at some particular point in time in town as well. And Portuguese has actually been a common language used in Batavia until well into the 1700s. Now, that painter that shows us how the city looked like is right here. You can see the fort. He's looking towards the north. He's on the west side of the river. You can see the river here as well. And it gives us a nice impression of how this city looked like at the time. There's a lot of interesting details in it, but I'm going to highlight just three. And they're right at the forefront of the painting. At the very left, you can see two Chinese men, seemingly in some kind of negotiations. There's a dog there as well. Then a little bit to the left, there's a Dutch couple with somebody who's holding up something to shield them against the burning sun. And a little bit further to the left, you see a particular small guy in some kind of striped shirt. And I'm going to show a detail of this painting, this particular third guy here as well, because he's important actually. This is on the left, an enlargement of that man that we saw in the picture of Beekman in 1650s. And this man looks Indian. He's got a striped dress, as I mentioned, and that was very particular because people would dress differently according to where they came from. Chinese, there were regulations on how they had to dress. Same for the Dutch, same for other people. And these were what they called mardijkers. Mardijkers is a Malay word that comes from Malay. It means freedom, merdeka. And mardijkers were people who are freed. Those were people, slaves, Indian slaves. And this guy is presumably has maybe some Indian origins. But very often Indian slaves that were brought by the Portuguese to Malacca and ended up in Batavia. These slaves spoke fluent Portuguese, but upon conversion to Christianity, they were freed. So they had their own life. Now, they were not always the richest. Some of them have been very successful. A lot of them were actually rather poor. And there was a large influx of these people in around, say, 1640, because the Dutch eventually kicked the Portuguese out of the Indonesian Malay archipelago. That is the city of Malacca. They took control over it. They didn't really want to control it. The control was handed over to local landlords at the time, but the Portuguese were gone. So they had control over the trade in the Indonesian archipelago. And some of these Portuguese mardijkers went to Jakarta. But Jakarta was pretty fully built at the time. So that influx of people meant that people needed to start to live outside the city as well. And this was a bit of a problem because outside the city wasn't necessarily very safe. So the Dutch went to some of the local Indonesian kingdoms that were either close or a little bit further away, but had the potential aggression or ability to form an